What's very significant and interesting about the Christian mystical tradition is that although we think of mysticism and contemplative experience as very personal, very interior, maybe even very individual, it always creates community. And we see that when we look back upon the mystical tradition in terms of the schools, certain mystical schools that flourish, grow up, and produce tremendous fruit, which can then, of course, be shared by the church as a whole. And one of the most important and enriching of these mystical schools is what we call the Cappadocian Fathers. And when I visited Cappadocia in modern-day Turkey last year, I was very attracted by the archaeological remains of the monastic movement, which mirrored that of the Egyptian desert at about the same time, the 4th century. And it brings home to you very, very powerfully both the seriousness of their spiritual journey, how intense, how dedicated they were to it, and also that it was both personal and solitary and communal at the same time. The Cappadocian Fathers, as we understand them, the three great figures, Gregory of Nyssa, Gregory of Nazianzen, and St. Basil, were friends. Gregory and Basil were brothers, and Nazianzen their friend, and the relationship between them was a very fertile one. They brought different qualities, different experiences, different personalities to their reflection upon experience, and this is what all theology is really about. In the Eastern Church, and of course these were Eastern Christians, it's always been understood, and still is, that essentially theology is about mysticism, and all theology is mystical theology. In the Western Church we became more abstract, more philosophical and so on, but in the Eastern Church the emphasis upon the relationship of experience to thought in Christian theology and Christian thinking has never been doubted. So what do they teach us? Well, first of all, they were all classically educated. Today that would mean that they would have had a knowledge of the essential sciences of their time. So I think today the Christian thinker, the Christian theologian needs to be grounded in as much of modern science and as much of modern sociology, the social sciences, as we can be. Of course, the bank of knowledge has been increased greatly since the 4th century. But what the Cappadocian Fathers bring to their reflection on the faith is a civilized, integrated form of knowledge. Again, they're not in any way fundamentalist or exclusivist, but they are highly focused, and they're focused upon both the mystery of the human and the mystery of the divine. We think of them today as having formed many of the major categories of orthodoxy, Christian orthodoxy. But at the time, they were pioneers, they were explorers. They were going further in their thought and in their understanding than people had gone before. And they were trying, as all Christians, thinkers need to do, they were trying to connect and relate the mystery of Christ to all forms of knowledge and experience. Gregory of Nazianzen has a particular emphasis upon the life of the Trinity. And the Trinity could become, in Christian thinking, a very dry, a very static kind of image of God, a certain model of God that we have. And I've read Trinitarian theology that just puts you to sleep. It becomes very, very abstract and hair-splitting. But in the way that Gregory understands it, it's a very dynamic model of God. God is not simply a Platonic, and they were all influenced by Plato, the great thinker of the time, the great philosophical influence on all thinkers. But for Plato, God was still, God was unchanging, God was a solid monolith at the highest level. But for Gregory of Nazianzen and for the other two, God is best understood as this communion of love, which is constantly creating itself and constantly overflowing from itself into creation through the work of love. Even more, they speak about the human being as conformed to this, that we are created in the image and likeness of the Trinity. And so we ourselves have this capacity for change, and we have this capacity to be changed into God. Theosis is the key goal of all Christian Christian theology and the Christian meaning of life, that we are intended towards divinization. And that's possible for us because we already have this seed in our own nature. So the Cappadocians give us not only some amazing insights into the nature of God as this experience of love that is constantly renewing and changing, and yet never changing, but also, as a result of that, some profound insights into the capacity of the human, and therefore gives us great hope for the human. We also see in Gregory an emphasis upon how this happens in the soul, that means in the deepest part of the human, because we are, in a way, mirroring. We are a mirror, the soul as a mirror. This is an important image in their mystical theology. And this changes the way we see ourselves. As we think of ourselves as a mirror reflecting the glory of God within us, this takes us beyond the idea of ourselves as an observer or as a separate being. We begin to see that the image and the reality can be united. And it's this henosis, this is the Greek word that they used for union, that this integration of the human then leads to the divinization. And this is a dynamic process. Of course, it occurs over time, over many years, over our lifetime. But they give us a way of understanding human experience in mystical terms, not only psychological terms. However, of course, they were very conscious, as were the Desert Fathers in the 4th century, of the influence of human psychology upon this journey into the divine, this full realization of human potential in divinization. So, for example, we hear in these Cappadocian Fathers what we also see in the Desert Fathers, but in a more elaborated and a more sophisticated kind of philosophy and theology. We hear about ascesis, first of all. Ascesis is a Greek word that we can probably best translate today as training. It was actually used, St. Paul uses it, to describe the way an athlete trains for competition. And we don't often think of today of religious experience and our involvement in a religious organization as training ourselves, keeping fit, keeping constantly in the best condition. But this was how they saw spiritual practice and prayer, and also the importance of self-control, self-regulation, the importance of living with others. All of these are forms of ascesis and training. Community is also at the heart of this, as we saw in the theology of the mysticism of community and friendship in St. John and St. Paul. We live in a a westernized culture which has overemphasized the importance of the individual. More and more people are living on their own in big cities. And the experience of community, however, is something that we also need and hunger for. That's part of the ascesis, part of the training and the self-disciplining that allows us to fulfill our human potential and to be conscious of filling it. For these Cappadocian Fathers, it's important that we know what is happening, that we can make meaning as well as we can out of the experience of our lives as it unfolds. Another really important part, of course, of the psychological dimension of this journey is controlling those tendencies within us, which they called the passions, of greed or lust or anger and so on, that these are seeds within us that can form and reform very quickly. We don't eliminate them at any one moment, but we can diminish their influence. We can learn to control them, because if we can't control them, they will control us. So again, there's this very insightful awareness of the relationship between psychology and theology in these Cappadocian teachers. If we look at another concept like purity, for example, today when we use the word purity, I think in a Christian context, we almost immediately start thinking of sexual purity. And Christianity has become more and more identified with morality and, of course, with sexual morality in particular in recent generations. And what gets into the headlines is the arguments going on among Christians about sexual issues. But purity for these Cappadocian Fathers is not primarily about morality. It's primarily an ontological experience or ontological state. That means it's to do with our very nature. That purity of heart, as Jesus calls it in the Beatitudes, is something that will shape our behavior, our thinking, our relationship with each other, but in itself it precedes the moral or the active. It's a contemplative and a mystical concept. And it is to do with finding our original innocence. John Main said that in meditation we recover our innocence. And some of these fathers spoke about even recovering our virginity. In other words, we're going back to the original source, to our factory, whatever it is. We reset to factory condition. We go back to our original nature. And the Cappadocians see purity as really being ourselves and learning to control, to discipline those aspects of ourselves, what St. Paul calls sin, to be able to control these, diminish them, and prayer, pure prayer, as they called it, or the prayer of the heart, contemplative prayer, is the primary ascesis, it's the primary work of the Christian. Of course, it isn't centered upon oneself in a narrow, subjective or egotistical way. It's not about my experience only, because it opens us up beyond the ego to our relationship to the world, to each other in Christ. What we see, I think, in the Cappadocians is a sense of wonder. Christ, for them, has become an amazing revelation about everything, about the human, about the cosmos, about God. And they are filled with this sense of excitement at what the Christian vocation is about. John Main once said that he thought the besetting sin of Christians is that we underestimate our vocation. We underestimate the wonder of our Christian meaning. And this is why it's so important for us to connect with the mystical tradition, to relate it to ourselves, to see ourselves as part of that tradition, and to be filled with that sense of wonder and hope, of course, that comes from it. What comes from it, as St. Gregory of Nyssa emphasizes, is an experience of continual progress. This is something that Plato would not have related to at all. Plato thought that we come to our goal, we come to God, and that's it. But St. Gregory, picking up a phrase of St. Paul where he says he's constantly striving, constantly moving ahead, leaving behind the past and moving into the future, epiktasis is the Greek word, that this is actually the condition of human growth. So we're filled with awareness of goals and objectives and evaluation in the modern world, in modern culture, in all our professions. But here is something that transcends that. This is a vision of human development, of human growth, that doesn't get stuck on limited objectives, and that sets us free to grow continuously from glory to glory, as St. Gregory says. However, this journey into the infinite progress and the infinite stages of perfection, this is very important, I think, for us, the infinite stages of perfection, is a journey through both darkness and light. We have to go into this process in the darkness of faith. It means we don't know what's going to happen. We can't control it. The left brain is going to be very disturbed by this experience of contemplation. This is why when we start to meditate and begin this journey consciously, we often get unsettled, we doubt it, we feel that it's not working. The left brain simply can't handle this experience because it is an experience of paradox. At the heart of all mystical theology is this discovery of the union of opposites, that what seems to be irreconcilable actually does come to unity within the faith relationship. So paradox, entering into the darkness of faith so that we can find the light of love. That's the way into being transformed from glory to glory and coming into this experience of God as infinite growth, infinite potential. When we come to meditation, we often are saying to ourselves, what is going to happen next? How long do I have to do this? When is something going to happen that will satisfy my desire for experience? What the Cappadocian Fathers give us is a way of understanding that we can let go of those kinds of questions. We can live with paradox. Our right brain is much more comfortable with paradox, with living without answers, with living within uncertainty than our left brain. So, and yet we know from science that both hemispheres of the brain are involved in everything we do. All thinking, all feeling, all perception. But there is a world of difference between these two approaches. The Cappadocians remind us of what this mystical, contemplative, if you like, right brain understanding means. But they also show us that it bears fruit in our life as we become more fully human, and that's the goal of all ascesis, of all prayer, of all spiritual practice. As we become more human, the Dalai Lama says, if our religion does not make us into nicer people, then it's not working. The Cappadocians understand that deeply, that our mystical experience, our contemplative practice, our ascesis, awakens in us the spirit of love, which transforms not only the way we see ourselves, but the way we live with others.